Okay, I'm going to kick off to first of all say thank you everybody for joining. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Peter Ashworth and I'm the Director of the Institute for Energy Transition here at Curtin University. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the Whadjuk elders, past and present, and pay our respects to all the traditional owners that are here on Noongar Budja land where Curtin operates, and also, I guess, acknowledge because we're coming from around Australia, there's multiple areas of traditional owners that we should acknowledge. And also, I think for energy transition, it's really important. I'm sort of there's a lot of conversation about the opportunities to participate. I think we've behooves us all to work well to really sort of make sure that we allow that. So this is part of Pathways to Net Zero Precincts, which is part of Race for 2030. And I can see that Bill Lilly's just joined. So we'd like to acknowledge sort of it's a pretty significant, well, it is a significant project. And I think from the point of view of net zero, really important to think about what that looks like and where we can add value. There are different pathways, and each year there's another forum around different discussions. And so this is to do with CER, DER, and grid integration. And you can see from the primer, we've got quite a broad cross section. And it really is about sort of this, I suppose, thought provocation to think about what's happening. There's a number of case studies that we've been working with, and we're going to start off with having a presentation from Dave Morgan about one of those precincts, and I'll leave him to share the details. But the whole format of today is you can see all these wonderful Race for 2030 backgrounds, not Bill's, the ones that we all look alike. These are our wonderful facilitators. And so the forum format is that we'll have a presentation as a bit of a thought starter, and then we'll have any sort of questions for clarification, and then we'll go into breakout rooms, and each of the facilitators will lead you through the discussion. There's a couple of things that you need to know. We will be recording those conversations. It's really just for our own note taking, because at the end we do want to synthesize any of the discussions that happen. And obviously, in the breakout rooms, they're much smaller. The best way to get someone's attention within such a large Zoom is to use the raise your hand function, which is down the bottom. So if you use your raise hand, that will elevate you to the top of the screen, and therefore then it's easier to interact. For the most part, you will be on mute until obviously you're in the rooms, and we'll sort of wrap up, and each time the breakout room ends, we'll bring you back to the main sort of like this here so that we can sort of move forward and have the next presentation. I think they're the main housekeeping things. When you and I'll sort of remind you of that, and we do have a couple of questions to go to sort of keep the conversation going. So I think without much further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dave Morgan, who's the Development Manager for Development WA, and he's going to talk about the Peel Business Park Nambeelup Kaadadjan lessons learned. So Dave, are you happy to share? And you can unmute, and I'll mute myself once you're...
Okay, thanks, Peter. Has everybody got my screen up on theirs now?
Yes, we can see it. Yep.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, just kicking off, my name obviously is Dave Morgan, if you looked at the program, and I'm a Development Manager at Development WA. And today I'm just going to be running you through some of the lessons learned from our microgrid installation at the Peel Business Park. Let me just see how I actually progress. And sorry, I'm having a technology little thing here. It's not progressing through my slide.
Down the bottom on your screen, sometimes there's an arrow. That worked.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, and we've got...
Great. I get this little menu popping up saying, do I want to unmute myself still? So it's a little bit alarming. Okay, just in terms of the goals I was hoping to kick today, I thought I'd just give you a bit of a background on the Peel Business Park. just before I leapt into motivations and some of the lessons learned. And then we're obviously going to break out into the breakout session where we'll handle some of the key reflections and what we need to do to change things to make sure that we learn from this going forwards. It's happening again. Okay, so the Peel Business Park. Look, at full build out, it's going to be 1,000 hectare general industrial estate. And but the first stage of the program, and I guess the 1,000 hectare area is shown by the red dotted lines, or maybe violet or pink or hot pink lines around the outside. That's ultimately going to be 1,000 hectares. And this precinct is going to be just outside Mandurah, just east of the freeway. But in order to get the party started, state government decided that we were going to activate what we call phase one, which is the area shown in black there. And that's 290 hectares, which has 4 landholders, of which Development WA had 1 piece of land. And that was one of the reasons why state government gave us some funding to actually bring in some trunk infrastructure to activate the area, because this was just traditional farmland. There was no infrastructure to actually service general industrial. I think it's just worth mentioning that the balance of the 710 hectares is comprised of 43 separate landholders. Okay, so in terms of a microgrid, I'm sure most people know what a microgrid is, but if you don't, it's probably worth mentioning that the microgrid is defined as a small network of electricity users with a local generation source. I think that's important. That's usually attached to a centralized grid, but is often able to function independently. So if you're a visual person like I am, what does that look like in a picture form? Well, generally you've got 3 components. You've got a network, which is shown, a local network shown in the brown, of users, which are shown there in blue. You've got a local generation source shown in green. And because you're generating power locally, you've got a retailing function where you need to sell power to those local users. You've obviously got a grid connection, which can be open and islanded if required. Those 3 functions are generally run by a microgrid operator, and in the instance of the Peel Business Park, we actually sought to get licenses, a network distribution license, a retail license for our microgrid operator. You don't need a generation license if you're under 10 meg, you get a general exemption. And I think the reason that we were keen for the microgrid operator to get licensing was to make sure that we could guarantee technical performance as well as all the customer protections. And we had an independent policeman that was going to actually make sure that all happened. So we didn't need to get involved in that. So what does the Peel Business Park look like? Well, we've got a grid connection coming out of Pinjarra Zone Substation. What we were required to do as part of state government funding was to actually bring in a lot of trunk infrastructure, and part of that was we brought in a distribution feeder to site. We then actually brought in and developed. Can everyone? Is there a problem?
Somebody's not on mute. That's all. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, so that we then, on our private land holding, designed and developed and installed our own distribution network. We then got our licensed microgrid operator to deploy the solar and the battery. I think it's worth mentioning at this point that this is really a business opportunity for the microgrid operator. It's not a technology play only. They basically come in, they actually invest in the generation, and from that they generate a revenue. We obviously needed to make sure that we had capability to and provision for the other landholders within the 290 hectares, and that there was the ability to expand that further into the wider 1,000 hectares as we went forward. So in terms of the motivations for the microgrid, I think the biggest driver that we had was that we had a constrained grid connection at Pinjarra Substation to actually service the full 290 hectares. And in order to do that, Western Party indicated to us that we were going to be paying anywhere between 50 and 80 million to upgrade the zone substation, upgrade the transmission line, and to also upgrade the transformer on the transmission line. We only had $49 million given to us by a state government to actually deliver all of the trunk infrastructure. So that included roads, water, power, gas, drainage, comms. So you can imagine, that budget, the electrical budget alone was more than the whole project budget. So, we basically hit the wall and we had to rethink, what we were going to do. We did have a little bit of grid power there, and that was going to give us enough power to actually service about 100 hectares, which coincidentally correlated to the size of DevWA's land holding. But that obviously was going to be problematic, because if we'd been given state government funds to activate the whole 290 hectares for all the private land developers as well as ourselves, and we only had enough power to do ourselves, that was really going to cause problems down the line when the other private developers wanted to come on. So it was really important that we actually got a solution that serviced the full 290. The other motivation that we had for the Peel Business Park was microgrid, was that we were trying to establish a new agri-processing industry in the area. And we knew that food producers were going to be very sensitive to having clean and green inputs, because we knew that their customers were going to demand that of them. So in terms of the power servicing, we needed to be thinking about renewable energy. We also needed to be thinking about how we were going to get independent sustainability credentials that our food producers could actually stick on labels and tell their customers about. So we decided to put our hands up for the Enviro Development Sustainability Accreditation. And one of the requirements there on the energy side, accreditations, was that you needed to reduce your carbon footprint beyond business as usual, at least by 20%. So we need to be doing something different there. And we also knew that agri-processing was very energy intensive. So we needed to be thinking about cheap power if we were going to attract food producers into the precinct. In terms of the lessons learned, I think we've learned in this process that we really need to try and get the same access, the equipment access rights for our private microgrid operator as our public operators like Western Power, Horizon Power currently enjoy. So currently the situation is that Western Power can actually access any of their equipment in private property or public road reserves through the Energy Operators Act, so they don't need to use any easements for that. Whereas our private operators who carry the same license, they do require easements at the moment in order to access their equipment in private land holdings and the road reserves. And that causes complexity in the solution because it requires, specialist knowledge. We need lawyers who know the Energy Operators Act to extract those bits into easements so that those provisions are actually allocated. They're also quite inflexible and costly. They can only be installed at DP registration, and in some cases they require ministerial approval. So they're very ungainly. And the weird thing is that the Energy Operators Act actually contemplates, privately licensed operators getting access to their equipment. It just hasn't been activated. So that's something that we really would like to remedy. I think just some of the smaller lessons that we've learned is that, just subtle differences between the private microgrid operator and the public network operator need to be communicated early. Just simple things like the inspection regime that Western Power use when they come to inspecting build form before they energize. That's normally on a sampled inspection system whereby, depending on the performance of the electrician who did the installation, they'll come out and they might do 1 in 10, 1 in 5 properties, whereas the microgrid operator has to test every installation under their regime. So they do have more cost there when it comes to doing testing, and invariably they pass that on to the customer, whereas Western Power only charges the customer if they have to come out and retest. Western Power also allows contractors to connect premises to their network. Obviously, they train them up, and there's a process and program for that. But our microgrid operator, being a bit smaller, they don't have an industry-wide scheme yet, so they require their personnel to connect. So there's a fee for that. And just minor things, just those minor differences can cause confusion when it comes to energization from the customer. And also just, who gets paid what. The customer needs to pay funds to the microgrid operator, whereas in the past, they would pay those to the electrician actually doing the installation work for them. So just small things like that can make a big difference. Another minor one, which we've also learned, which in deployment, can cause wrinkles, is part of our model was that the microgrid operator, in order to expand its generation footprint, it actually uses rooftop solar, and it uses customer roofs to do that. And in order to do that later down the line, when that power is actually needed, we need to make provision in the site main switchboard for additional space for metering protection when we actually install that at a later date. And conduits need to be installed in parking areas and buildings in order to pull them through those cables. You don't have to do it up front, but obviously when an owner has built their new premises, everything is looking schmicko, and then you need to go and dig up their parking lot to go and pull through cables. And similarly, you need to put cables on the outside of their building. It affects building aesthetics. So if you can actually get those in early, not only does it avoid unnecessary cost, but it also prevents damage to building aesthetics and just rework, which isn't necessary. So look, that closes my lessons learned. I think we're going to probably go into the breakout session now. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I guess we can answer any questions and jump into a little bit more.
Thanks, Dave. If you want to stop sharing, what we will do is I'll just put a call out if anyone does have any points of clarification, if they wanted to raise their hand. Then we can certainly ask those before we go to the breakout room. So if anyone does. Me, it seemed pretty clear. You could also put it into the chat if you like as well. I can't see any hands raised at this point. Oh, Maureen. Thank you, Maureen. Okay.
Hi, Dave. You talked a little bit about the Energy Operators Act, and that you wanted to, you said it doesn't contemplate private operators. That provision and it hasn't been activated, and you mentioned that you want to try and do that. Do you have a sense of how you would potentially?
Yeah, well, that all it requires is the Energy Minister, just through a regulation, can activate. I think in the Energy Operators Act, there are actually modules or sections where it actually talks of the different provisions. Obviously, in terms of our public operators, they've got access to acquire land, and they've got what some of I call the superhuman powers. Our private microgrid operators would only be seeking to get access to the provisions whereby they can actually access their equipment. I think it's a subset. So it's actually, I think, quite a simple process. I think we just need to get some of our electrical regulators just comfortable that we'd like to get that functionality activated, and then just get that into play.
Thanks, Dave. Can I just ask where you are now from where you started with this? Is there anything you would do differently if you were to start from today?
Look, I think that we've done all the really important things well, without blowing too much smoke up our tails. I think that because it was a first off, we took a lot of effort to actually deploy. For example, we were looking to activate a new precinct, trying to attract new customers. And we recognized that if we just said, look, we're going to get this operator and who's going to do all these great things for you, produce renewable power, it's at a 30% discount from the market. It all sounded too good to be true. So what we did was we actually were very conscious about establishing the operator, making sure they were licensed beforehand, that actually built the array and the battery, so it was all there, and they were on-site established. So I think that was important for us for a first sort of deployment. Where it comes to, for example, like the Ocean Reef, where we've gone for a second, we haven't had to deploy that up front because we've now got a reference point. So I think that was quite important. I think that, as I said, we've actually taken great pains to make sure that we've communicated the process. It's funny that just some of the minor things which I referred to, which are just communicating to the customers that, hey, there are some minor things, if they're not aware of that, then it can come up and bite you and create confusion and, concern. So I think that that's probably the most important thing, is just to highlight to people that, these are the differences. So it's almost copy and paste of Western Power, the same treatment, same sort of, I suppose, benefits that you'd get on the Swiss or better, but just make them aware of the subtle differences. I think that's really important. because we thought that the two minor ones there that I told you about, just the microgrid operator not organizing conduits, that can be a problem later. You've got someone who's built out a beautiful, new premise they're proud of, and now you want to actually go and plow through, their parking lot and dig it all up. So it might sound like a really small thing, but it becomes a big thing to them, if that makes sense. So pay attention to the small things,
Yeah, that's great. Front loading. So Bill's got a question, and then there's one in the chat from Phil that I'll read out. So over to you, Bill.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Dave, just a question. I mean, for the Net Zero Precinct project as a whole, we're looking at how to, get better outcomes of those type of infrastructure across Australia more broadly. And you've spoken, I think, to some quite specific WA detail there, particularly in a policy sense. So I'm interested to see what your thoughts are on the broader context of this across Australia versus just WA.
Yeah, look, I think that, and I'm not a guru on the East Coast in terms of, the regime, but I think that everybody's trying to, I think, implement similar measures. I think in our model, in WA, there seems to be a difference between a fully licensed type microgrid solution and then embedded networks, which have traditionally fallen under exemptions. And I think that on both sides, I think, of the Nullarbor, there's been a bit of effort put into, well, how do we actually put in a bit of customer protection and a bit more protection around the embedded network side? And I'm seeing that on both sides. So I think that there are some strong parallels. Whether or not you might find that you can actually get by with what I call the lighter version of the embedded network. I think what we deployed here was over green title. So that's a subtlety. All of these lots were green title, and therefore we went for the full license solution. But if it was strata title or you own the dirt, you wouldn't necessarily need to go for a full license solution. So I think that that's a nuance that's probably worth mentioning, is that, what's the land tenure of the land in the precinct that you're developing.
Thanks, Dave. To clarify, Philip said, did the businesses in the precinct know that they have to obtain their power from the microgrid, or could they remain connected to the grid? And what were the cost savings per megawatt?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that is unique about our microgrid was that we wanted to make sure that our customers weren't locked up, behind the gate, and that, any price gouging could happen. So what we did do is we actually put in a mechanism whereby the only obligation that customers actually had of the microgrid operator was they actually had to get a quote off them for their power. And if they weren't happy with that power, then obviously they could get other quotes. And the microgrid operator would actually facilitate power coming from outside the grid. And if there was a better deal that could be secured for the customers from outside the grid, then they were to honor that. So that's one of the mechanisms we put in place. But part of the process is that they still connect to the microgrid operator, unless, there is provision, like, I guess, if you actually had this huge load that, was 300 megawatt and needed an HT connection where you were looking to go to 230. I'm just trying to think what the high voltage is beyond that. But if you really needed a terminal substation, there is potential you could go through that, but you can also go through the microgrid operator to facilitate that. I think the benefit of the microgrid operator is that they do have lower costs to actually operate their microgrid. So with that 30% discount, it's beyond what we call the advertised retail synergy tariffs. It's very difficult for anyone to beat that. So it's very unlikely, that that's going to happen. And the only time we would see any customer wanting to go direct to the grid would be if they actually had a data center that was going to pull, 500 megawatt, and needed an HT connection.
Probably not the right spot then, would it?
Exactly. Yeah.
Just quickly, Bill and Leo, we'll take your questions and then we'll go to the breakout rooms, because otherwise we'll run out of time. So Bill, did you want to ask a follow-up?
No, sorry, just forgot to lower.
Okay, that's good. Leo.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting. Thanks for the presentation. You mentioned about the titles. You said you went for a green title and that was better than going strata. Have you considered community title? Is that something that's open for non-residential parks? And from your experience, do you think that would have, I don't know, lifted some of the constraints regarding setting up and then later operating the microgrid?
Yeah, look, I think it really comes down to what type of title are you seeking to use for the development. So I think this wasn't a case of how can we change the title to facilitate the microgrid. It was like, we want to release green title, and the energy solution had to work with that. So I think to answer your question, yes, look, this solution definitely would work in terms of a business coming in, deploying regeneration, etc. It would be simpler, I think, in strata stroke community title, because there you've got control over the land. So you don't actually, you've got an ownership model whereby you don't need to then create the easements. I think in the green title solution, you're actually selling that land to someone else. And what you're trying to do is put in some mechanisms by which the microgrid operator can then go and access the equipment on that land. So yes, the full complexity comes in through the fact that we've actually got green title and you don't have your foot on the land and you don't have control over it. So yes, in terms of communities and strata, that's a different solution. Doesn't require the easements and the complexity.
Thank you.